Okay, everyone, this is just a quick review of the curve brushes and some of their basic functions. I will only be using the curve tube snap and curve tube snap um, brushes in this little demo, just because I don't want to overcomplicate things with fancy brushes and stuff like that, but the basic functionality of all the curve brushes is the same. So first off, we're going to start with a polysphere in our scene. So if you don't have one, go and load one in. And then we are going to dock two of the menus over to the side that we will be concentrating on for this little review. One of them is the stroke palette and the other is the brush palette. So just dock both of those over to the side. Okay, so first things first, my polysphere, unlike most of yours that comes default in ZBrush, I have removed the subdivisions from mine. Yours will most likely have a couple of subdivision levels on it, so I'm going to add those to mine, just so we're all starting from the same place. Now, curve brush functionality cannot happen on an object with subdivision levels. So this is why I'm starting the same place as you guys. So if you just pop under your geometry palette on the right hand side here, you should notice that with your polysphere, you will probably see a low res and then a subdivision level of 3 and pretty much the same settings that I see over here. If you then were to go into your brush menu, isolate by the letter C to get to your curve brushes, and then this brush right here would be the curve tube snap brush. So we're going to start with that one. Just get that brush loaded in and then back into your scene. Curve brushes draw a curve across any mesh surface. This is why we need a mesh in there to begin with. It needs something to connect to in order to start drawing. So I'm just going to try and draw across this mesh. And we immediately get this message, which is why I subdivided my mesh in the first place. The mesh is composed of multiple subdivision levels. Delete or freeze subdivision levels and try again. So like I said, the curve brushes will not work on a mesh that has multiple subdivision levels. So your choice here is to either delete the subdivision levels on your object or freeze the subdivision levels on your object. Either one should allow you to start sculpting on here. In this particular case, I'm just going to choose to delete them. So I'm going to leave it at subdivision level 3 and just click on delete lower. Now there are no subdivision levels. The slider is off. I cannot change the resolution of this mesh right now just by using the slider. And now if I go to my curve tube snap brush and draw a curve across the surface, you will notice that immediately we get this nice tube that is drawn across our surface. Notice that it is about halfway indented into the surface, and when we finish drawing a curve, that it keeps that curve active and masks everything else. So you'll notice the sphere got significantly darker. That is because it has applied a mask to that sphere, and that mask allows us to only manipulate this curve without touching the sphere, and also gives us a very quick option if we just wanted to break this tube away to use one of our basic split functionalities under our subtool palette over here on the right. Under split, one of the options we have is split unmasked points, and you could click on that and it would separate this tube from the sphere and create a new subtool for it. So I will just do that as a demonstration right now. So I'm going to say split unmasked points, and there's what you're left with. We still have our sphere, and then we have this polysphere tube that has been broken off of it. At this point, I am going to just delete that tube that I broke off and go back just to the sphere, and we have this curve that is still on here. If I were to click on that curve, it will apply a new tube to that curve. These tubes, again, are based on our brush size. So at any point, you could come in, change your brush size, click on the curve, and it will automatically update every time you click on it. So you do not need to redraw a curve. If you got the size of it wrong, you can just come in, adjust your size, and click on the curve again. You will notice as I am going back and forth between the curve and off of the surface of the model over here that my cursor color is changing from red to this light blue color. The reason that is over here off the model I'm dealing with directly with my brush size, and that is where I need to adjust it to do those types of one-click adjustments. As soon as I'm over the line or the curve that it's drawn and it goes blue, I am now in a mode where I'm able to edit this curve, and you can see there's a little green dot that shows that I can, I'm over the curve and where I'm touching the curve. And if I were to click down and just start to drag, you'll notice that I can start to just push and pull that curve around, and it tries to stay stuck to the surface of the mesh. Although if you pull hard enough and go in the right direction, it will be able to pull itself off the mesh. So that is what we are creating, having as far as the two different colors of our brush when we're over the curve or off the curve. Much of what controls how these curves react and what you are able to do with these curves exists underneath our stroke palette, which is why we docked our stroke palette over to the left hand side here, and it all exists underneath these bottom three palettes under there, the curve functions, and curve modifiers. I'm going to go through these very quickly, and just as a review to what I taught the other day, this should be a nice little area where you can come back if you've forgotten something about these curves. All right. Oops. So I'm going to just undo to the point where I do not have a curve on my mesh anymore. I do need my subdivision levels. So right in here. All right. So first off, under the first curve menu, we have this curve mode button. What makes a curve brush is the fact that this button is on. If I go to any other brush, if I go to a move brush or a standard brush, you will notice this area is turned off because these are not curve brushes, and that is one of the big things that defines whether a brush is a curve brush or not a curve brush. So I have my curve tube snap brush actually as a quick pick down here. I'm just going to go back to it right now. So if you went off, you'll just may have to go back into your brush menu and get it. Right beside the curve mode line, there is this align lazy curve to align as line button, which is off for this brush by default. This button controls whether the tube is going to follow a curved line, something like this. And I'm just going to undo that. If I turn it on, what you'll notice is that I can click and draw a line, and it will draw a curve in a straight line from the beginning to the end of that curve and then drop it down. So this button basically just forces this curve to not be able to bend or not draw on the surface. It's just going to go from where you started to where you finished. So I'm just going to turn that off and undo that for a second. Curve step has to do with resolution of your curve as you draw it out. You can see here by default it's at 0.5, and that is a control that controls these divisions, the red, black divisions along your curve and how spaced out those are. So One way I can change those, if I came in here and turned this down to 0.025, so half of what it was, and I draw out another curve, you'll notice how many, whoa, that's a little less than half. I believe I put a 0.0 in there that shouldn't have been there. But you can see how many red, black, red, black, there's so many that it's actually sort of distorting that mesh because that was just way too many. So I'm just going to put that back to 0.5. Should have been 0.25, not 0.025. Controls, and then I'm going to undo, get rid of those two. So that is the curve step slider. That is also controlled by default by your brush size. If I have a smaller brush size, you'll notice that those lines are much closer together, and if I have a larger brush size, they are much more spaced out. That is a default action of the curve brushes. So in most cases, you could just come in, draw your curve across, and then if you wanted the curve to be a little, or the tube to be a little bit thicker, make a larger brush size and then just click on there. But you'll notice it is changing the resolution. So it would only be if you needed a much higher resolution on a thick curve that you would have to come in here and make those types of adjustments. Hope that makes sense. Okay, next button beside is the bend button. Sorry, dropped the microphone there. The bend button, basically it talks about how this curve will bend with respect, or whether it will bend, and I will demonstrate that in a second. And this snap button tells it whether it's going to snap onto a mesh, much like we have here. This is what causes it to be a snap curve tube snap brush. If I turn that off and draw, I can draw, you can see I can draw right off the side, and it doesn't necessarily try and snap exactly to the mesh in the same way. So that is what the snap function is doing. Back to the bend. So with the bend, if I draw out a curve like this, and as I did before, if I hover in the middle and start to pull, you'll notice that it starts to bend that curve, and I can adjust some of the shape of that curve just by pulling on different sections. If I turn off this bend and come in here and grab onto that curve, you'll notice it no longer bends. It's just going to move itself in relation to how I'm dragging it in 3D space. So that is what that bend is doing. Underneath there we have two buttons, elastic and liquid. These are controlling the nature of the bend that it will perform on any curve. Elastic meaning it will bend much like an elastic. If I start pulling it from here, it is going to pull like an elastic, very straight line from here up to here. It's going to create that sort of stretched out feeling in those bends as you start to pull it out. That is elastic. And if I go to liquid, it acts more like a liquid as you start to pull more out. It's much more fluid and bendy. And you'll notice I'm also adding length to the curve while I'm using these types of things. Okay, so just play around with those, and you can see, and I'm just going to turn them both off here. Right underneath elastic and liquid is lock start and lock end. They do very much what they say they do. So you draw out a curve, you have a start point on the left here where I started drawing, an end point on the right where I ended drawing, and if I click on lock start and start dragging the curve, that start position will not move. It is stuck. It's like I pinned it down onto the mesh over there. And lock end will do the same thing, just at the other end. And you could lock them both if you had them in very specific locations that you wanted, and then you could come in and sort of tweak a little bit what's happening in between those points without worrying about pulling them off of the points that you want. And if you were to add a liquid in there, I could actually make it longer without moving those endpoints or doing anything like that. Okay, so that is that. Just undoing a bunch here, get back to a base mesh. And underneath the curve palette, we have curve functions. Curve functions are some other controls about the curve brushes. I'm just going to draw one on here. And I'm going to draw another one on and another one on. And sometimes when you're doing this and you're drawing on different curves, and then you go off and you start doing some other work somewhere else, you'll come back and sometimes you'll have these curves left over, or you've established a curve and it's still in the mesh, and maybe you just want to throw away that curve because you don't want to accidentally come in here and click on it and resize something. You just want to throw the curve away and commit, yes, that is the mesh that I wanted to create. That is where you get this delete button. So if I click on delete, you'll notice that it just threw away the curve. I can no longer come in here and accidentally click on it and change the size. I'm just gonna undo. Oh, look at that, and it won't let me undo that. So there we go. Oh, we're okay. All right, so I can draw out another curve. I'm intentionally going to make it a little jaggy like this. Snapshot, I'm not 100% sure how that works or what exactly we want to use that for, so I'm going to skip that. Curve function smooth. So I have a line that I've drawn out that is all jaggy, or sort of squiggly like this. And if I come in here and start tapping on this smooth, and also this slider affects how much this is going to work, so you can play around with the two. If I start clicking on it, you can notice what that curve is doing. It's still flowing very much in the way that I told it to, but it's starting to try and smooth out those transitions in the curved areas to give me a little smoother look to my curve. This can sometimes be helpful if you're trying to draw a curve and maybe you're getting a little funny pinch or something in it. You could just try and get it with a smooth a couple times, and you might be able to resolve and just click and update that and get a slightly cleaner curve that you might be looking for. The frame mesh functions, what these are doing is drawing curves around certain features on a mesh if you want to. So if you had a border on the mesh, or you had polygroups on the mesh, or you have crease edges on the mesh, having one of these on and then pressing frame mesh will actually draw a curve on your mesh based on whichever one of these you are wanted to draw on. So say I was trying to draw a tube in some sort of crazy shape that follows a polygroup that I had already established on this mesh for some other purposes of modeling. So I'm just going to turn on my polyframes to show you what I'm talking about. So here we go. We have our mesh with our polyframes on. You can see it is only one polygroup right now. I'm actually just going to change my material to white to make it a little easier to see my polygroups. Now I'm going to hold Control Shift, and we all remember that under our Control Shift menu, under this top area, we have our slice, curve, and slice brushes. These slice through your model and create separated polygroups based on that slice line. So I'm going to come through here with my slice curve brush. I'm going to start drawing across here. Right about here, I'm going to tap on, still holding Control Shift down, I'm going to tap on the Alt key and keep dragging. And remember, that gives us a smooth curved line. And if I double tapped on the Alt key, it would give me a harder edged line. So I can do something like that, and you can see how it just cut a new edge along that curve where I drawn it and gave me separated polygroups on each side. So I'm just going to actually come in here and turn off the grid so we're only seeing the polygroup I created. Nice clean polygroup going through there. Now with the frame function, if I wanted a tube that was going to sort of follow that line all the way around, say this was like some sort of a space helmet, and this was the window where the person could look out of, and this was the rest of the helmet back here, maybe I want a little seam or an edge or a tube around there that's almost like the rubber seal that would bind them together. I could come in here, turn off border, turn off creased edges, and just have polygroups and say frame mesh. And you'll notice, if I zoom in, there is now a curve which follows exactly along that polygroup edge that I had. Now with my clay tubes brush selected and picking some brush size, which remember I can always adjust later, if I come in here and click on that, look what I get. I get this nice tube that follows perfectly around that area and gives me a really nice separation and potential mesh to continue modeling from in that area. So that is really cool functionality, really helpful when you're trying to do certain types of models and other things. So just play around with that. It's a great tool to understand how the frame functions work. Okay, so that is the frame, that is that whole curve functions menu. I'm going to delete that curve, and you'll notice that it's still masked. So I have basically, I could just right now come down to split unmasked points because that tube is not masked, but the sphere is masked, but the tube is not. If I happen to have cleared my mask like this, and I have those two parts and I still want to take that tube off, notice it makes it a separate polygroup. So we have all the same functionality that we've been using in many of the things that we've done so far, where you can hold down control shift, and I'm just going to go on to a standard brush or something like this. I don't think it matters, but control shift, and I can actually just click on that polygroup and isolate everything else. All I've done by doing that is hide the sphere. It is still, notice it's still there, it is still part of this subtool. It's just that it is now hidden. But that also gives us access to another one of the split functions, which is split hidden, which will basically take the two parts apart, just like with the unmasked points. So if you forget to do something when something's masked and you're not sure, there's always another way to take something apart or do whatever it is you want to do. So I'm just going to say split hidden, and there you go. So now I have my sphere as one subtool, and I have my little frame mesh as a separate subtool, which is really convenient, and I can continue moving on and modeling other things from there. So I'm just going to delete that tube for now, and back to my sphere. And for right now, I'm just going to turn off polyframes and just get it back to a regular sort of white sphere here. Actually, I'm going to turn it to matcap gray, a little easier to see. All right. Now we're going to talk about curve modifiers down here at the bottom of these three curve menus. The curve modifiers, grab my curve tube snap brush, allow for many of the controls to affect the shape or some of the parameters around how it's going to draw this tube. So if you notice, if I draw it on here, it is a very standard tube, same length at each end, very consistent size all the way through. I'm not 100% sure about the intensity. It's never really, I've never truly figured out what it does. It's on by default, so I'm just going to leave it alone. We have this size button right next to it that is not active. If we activate that, we will then be activating this curve fall off menu under here. And notice this button has one of those gray lines that sort of go from corner to corner in it, and that is showing you that there is a sub palette under here that has a graph connected to it. So I'm just going to click on that and open it up, and you end up with one of these. I know I taught this much earlier in the course, and I told you at that time that you would find this type of control palette all over the place in ZBrush. This is one of those places. So I'm going to turn on the size function, which allows this to have an effect. What we are looking at here is the graph, which shows us the shape from the start to the end of this curve. This graph is showing me that if I were to update this curve, it would have no size at its beginning, and then it would get bigger, 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 bigger until it was 100% of its size at the other end. 100% being whatever your brush size is determining that to be. So if I come in here and just click on the curve, it will update, and there you go. So now I have a very small tip on that curve, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the way out to the other end. So that is what I'm controlling with this. Remember, you can come in here and click on these little orange dots, and you can make all kinds of nice adjustments to that curve. I could make it sort of a not go completely to 0 on each end, and then I could make it a little fatter in the middle and come in and update that. And this is partially a big part of what I showed you guys in our lessons the other day, is that if you play around with these and update your mesh, that looks a lot like the beginnings of a muscle, particularly bicep muscles, some of the leg muscles. This would be a very good starting mesh to be sculpting those from. Okay, so this is a great tool, and I will demonstrate this at another time if anybody wants me to demonstrate that again, because I know I did it the other day. Okay, so right below this, in this lower part, there's all kinds of focal shift and tile. And if you start playing around with the tile, you'll notice, so tile by default is 1, so it has one of those wave shapes in it. I could establish one of those wave shapes, and I could say, well, no, I want you to do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those same curves along this curve. And now if I were to click on it, there you go. It updates and it follows along that curve. So that's the tile function. If you want to use that, the step strength, just get in there and play around with a lot of these things. It's pretty self-explanatory, a lot of them. Flip horizontals, flip verticals, reset. That'll just reset everything back to the beginning. Undo, saves, loads. That means you could establish a curve that you really like, and you want to may want to use it again on a different model or in a different tool or a different project somewhere. You could save this out, and it will save itself as a little file that you would then be able to come back in and load and reestablish a identical curve for another project or something like that. So that is that area. If you want to close this area, there's the little close at the bottom once you open something like that up. So you just click on that and it will sort of bring that menu back up. Curve edit radius. This basically tells you how close. You'll notice as I get closer and closer, boom, right there. That is where I am curve editing, where that green circle shows up. So that is the curve edit radius of 64. If I were to make that smaller, say down to 26, and I come in, I have to get closer to that curve before it's going to give me that green circle. Curve edit radius doesn't seem to be totally working that way, but whatever. Play around with it, figure it out. Focal shift, I'm not sure. Curve snap distance, this is the relative distance it needs to be to another mesh in order to snap onto that mesh. And the curve projection range is if our mesh had a lot of detail in it. The higher this number, the more it will try and follow the detail that's in the mesh you are drawing the curve on. The lower the number, it might skip over some finer ridges and details that are in the mesh it's being drawn on and just sort of follow the basic form of it and not really get down into all those grooves and crevices. So that's the projection range slider. So there you go. That is those 3 curve menus and sort of how they work. Get in there, pull the sphere in, play around with a bunch of curves on the sphere. The reason I'm just doing a sphere is they need a mesh in order to draw, like I said at the beginning. There's one other function or area that does control portion of how these curves work on the surface. I'm just going to turn off size, so now my tubes will go back to being normal no matter what I do here if that size button is off. There's one other area that affects, you'll notice at the beginning I said, look how this tube is sort of inset, sort of halfway inside of that mesh, because it is a full tube, but it's partially indented into the mesh that it's being drawn on. We can control this, but this is not under the stroke curved area, which seems a little silly to me that it's not in the same area. It is under the brush area. And if we come down here to the third section down, there is a depth palette. In this depth palette, you will see this orange square with a circle, and the lower half is dark, the upper half is light. Think of this as the radius of your curved tube snap. Think of the dark area as the area inside of this model, inside of its surface, the light area is part outside of the surface, and if we just come in and grab onto this, I could drag this up, and now the next mesh or curve that I draw on here, you'll notice that the tube is sitting more on the surface because that is how I have told it to sit in relation to how it's being drawn. So you do have that control as to how far the tube is going to inset into that surface. I could inset it really quite far and only have a little bit of it sticking out. So you have a lot of choices there. This is also a very convenient thing to have when you're doing muscles, because sometimes you want the muscle to be sitting on the surface a little more, and then you want to have your size control, and you want it to sort of have this type of shape, and then you draw it across your surface, and there you go. It has a really nice sort of muscle shape, but it's already kind of sitting outside of the area that you're trying to work with. So that is that for the curve brushes and how they work. When I get to showing muscles and different techniques, one of the techniques I did show you guys and will show you again, I'm sure, is using these curve brushes. So that's it for the curve brushes for now, and look forward to recording you guys another video. Take care.